My name is Garnet Davis, and at 81 years old, I want you to know something that'll shake you to your bones. 15 years ago, when I was 66, I married a 25-year-old boy who tried to kill me with love. 8 times a day, every single day, he touched me with hands that weren't seeking pleasure, but my grave. I'm sitting here on my front porch in Guthrie, Oklahoma, where the summer heat still clings to everything like a wet blanket even as evening falls. Most folks around here know me as the quiet widow who tends her small vegetable garden and waves from this old rocking chair. They see my gray hair pulled back in the same bun I've worn for decades, my house dress faded from too many washings, and they think they know my story. They think I'm just another old woman whose exciting days are long behind her. Lord, if they only knew. I've carried this secret in my chest like a stone for 15 years now, and I've decided it's time to let it out. Not because I'm looking for pity or judgment, but because there might be another woman out there. Maybe someone who thinks she's too old for danger, too forgotten for anyone to want to harm her. Maybe someone who, like me, believed that surviving one terrible marriage meant she'd earned the right to some peace and tenderness in her golden years. I was wrong about so many things back then, but I was right about one. Even when you think you've seen all the darkness this world has to offer, there's always someone willing to show you a deeper shade of black. And sometimes, just sometimes, that someone comes wearing the face of salvation itself. So settle in with me, won't you? Let me tell you how a woman my age almost died from too much loving, and how the good Lord gave me the strength to see through the devil's disguise. Because if my words can help even one soul recognize the wolf dressed as their answer to prayer, then maybe all that suffering wasn't for nothing. Maybe you'll help my story find its way to whoever needs to hear it most. You have to understand something about my life before Owen came along. It was like living in a house where all the windows were painted black. For 40 years I was married to Roy Davis, and that man's idea of love was making sure I knew my place, which was always 3 steps behind him and 2 degrees scared. Roy had hands like ham hocks and a temper that could turn a sunny morning into a thunderstorm. He never hit me where it would show. Oh no, he was too smart for that. The bruises lived under my sleeves, under my dress, in places where even the church ladies couldn't see them during our Wednesday prayer circles. When folks asked about the way I flinched when he'd reach for the salt at Sunday dinner, I'd just smile and say I was getting jumpy in my old age. But it wasn't age making me jumpy. It was 40 years of walking on eggshells that kept cracking under my feet no matter how careful I tried to be. The worst part wasn't the bruises, though. The worst part was how he made me feel like I was disappearing, piece by piece, year by year, until I couldn't remember who I'd been before I became Mrs. Roy Davis. I used to love to sing. Did you know that? Used to have a voice that could carry the whole congregation through amazing grace on Sunday mornings. But Roy said my singing was showing off, said it wasn't fitting for a wife to draw attention to herself like that. So I stopped singing. Stopped a lot of things, actually. When I finally got the courage to leave him at 66, and Lord knows it took me that long to work up the nerve, this whole town acted like I'd committed some kind of mortal sin. The whispers followed me to the grocery store, to the post office, even to church. Poor Roy, they'd say, abandoned by his wife after all those years. Nobody asked why I left. Nobody wondered what might have driven a woman my age to start over with nothing but the clothes on my back and a heart full of fear. That's when I made what everyone called my second mistake, though I didn't see it that way at first. I fell in love with Owen Mitchell, a 25-year-old man who looked at me like I hung the moon and promised me things I'd never dared dream of. Safety, tenderness, a reason to remember how to smile. People in town didn't just whisper about that, honey. They talked out loud, right where I could hear them. Called me a fool, a cradle robber, said I was making a spectacle of myself chasing after a boy young enough to be my grandson. But when Owen held my hand and told me I was beautiful, when he said age was just a number and love didn't have a calendar, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. I felt alive. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have imagined in my wildest nightmares, was that Owen had been watching me for months before he ever said his first hello, studying me like a hunter studies his prey, learning my habits, my loneliness, my desperate hunger for someone to treat me gentle. And I walked right into his trap with my heart wide open, grateful as a woman dying of thirst who's offered a drink of water. I thought I was finally getting my happy ending. I had no idea I was signing my death warrant. I first laid eyes on Owen Mitchell on a Tuesday morning at Hendrick's hardware store, which sits right on Main Street between the post office and what used to be Miller's Five and Dime. I was there buying a new lock for my front door. After leaving Roy, I'd moved into a little rental house on Elm Street, and I wanted to make sure I was the only one with a key. Owen was behind the counter that day, filling in for old Mr. Hendricks who'd thrown his back out again. When I walked in, this young man looked up from whatever he was reading and smiled at me like I was someone worth smiling at. Not the polite, pitying smile I'd grown used to from folks in town, but something warm and genuine that reached all the way to his green eyes. "Well, hello there," he said, and his voice had this gentle quality to it, like honey poured over warm biscuits. "What can I help you with today, ma'am?" Ma'am? When was the last time someone had called me ma'am with respect instead of dismissal? I found myself smoothing down my hair, wishing I'd worn something prettier than my old blue house dress. "I need a deadbolt," I said, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. "Something good and strong." He nodded seriously, like my safety was the most important thing in the world to him. "You've come to the right place. A woman living alone needs to feel secure in her own home." The way he said it, without judgment or that patronizing tone I was used to, made something flutter in my chest that I thought had died years ago. As he showed me different locks, his fingers would brush mine when he handed me the packages to feel their weight. Each touch was electric, sending little shocks up my arms that I hadn't felt since, well, maybe never. Roy had never touched me gentle like that, even when we were courting. "You know," Owen said as he rang up my purchase, "I don't think I've seen you around before. I'm Owen Mitchell. Just moved here from Tulsa about a month ago." "Garnet Davis," I said, then caught myself. "Well, I guess it's just Garnet now." He tilted his head, curious but not pushy. "Fresh start?" "Something like that." "Good for you," he said, and the way he said it made it sound like he truly meant it. "Takes courage to start over. Not everyone has that kind of strength." I walked out of that hardware store feeling lighter than I had in years, carrying more than just a new lock. I carried the memory of how he'd looked at me. Not through me, not past me, but at me, like I was a woman worth seeing. Owen started finding reasons to be wherever I was after that. At the grocery store, he'd appear in the cereal aisle just as I was trying to reach something on the top shelf. At the library, he'd settle into the chair across from mine with a book of his own. Never pushy, never inappropriate, just there. Present in a way that made me feel like maybe I wasn't as invisible as I thought. The first time he asked me for coffee, I almost said no. What would people think? What would they say? But then I looked into those green eyes and thought, what do I care what they say? I've spent my whole life worrying about what other people think, and where did it get me? So I said yes. We met at Dolly's Diner on a Wednesday afternoon, when the lunch rush was over and the place was nearly empty. Owen ordered black coffee and apple pie. I ordered tea and tried to calm my nerves. We talked for 2 hours, about books, about the weather, about everything and nothing. He listened when I spoke, really listened, leaning forward with his chin in his hand like my words were poetry. "You have beautiful eyes," he said suddenly, right in the middle of my story about trying to grow tomatoes in my backyard. "They're like the color of coffee with just a splash of cream." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "Oh, go on." "I mean it," he said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "You're a beautiful woman, Garnet. I hope you know that. Beautiful." At 66, after 40 years of being told I was too loud, too quiet, too something or not enough something else, this young man was calling me beautiful. As we walked back to my house that afternoon, our hands somehow finding each other, I felt like a teenager again. The sun seemed brighter, the air sweeter, even the sound of Mrs. Patterson's wind chimes next door seemed like music instead of noise. "Can I see you again?" Owen asked as we reached my front porch. "I'd like that," I said, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in a long time. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have seen then, was how Owen's eyes followed me even when he thought I wasn't looking. How he'd memorized my schedule, my habits, the times I was most alone. How his questions about my health, my doctor visits, my family history weren't just the caring inquiries of a man falling in love. They were the careful calculations of a predator marking his territory. But that Wednesday afternoon, standing on my porch with my hand still tingling from his touch, all I knew was that for the first time in decades, I felt like maybe life still had some sweetness left to offer me. I had no idea how bitter that sweetness would turn. The moment everything changed happened on a Friday evening in September, about 6 weeks after Owen and I started seeing each other regular-like. I remember the date because it was the same night as the church social, and I'd chosen to stay home with Owen instead of going to help serve coffee and cake to the congregation. That choice alone should have told me how far I'd already fallen. We were sitting on my front porch swing, watching the sun paint the sky all shades of pink and orange, when Owen started talking about his grandmother. He told me she'd lived to be 93, sharp as a tack, right up until the end, and how he'd learned to appreciate the wisdom that comes with age by taking care of her in her final years. The way he spoke about her, with such tenderness and respect, made my heart swell with something I hadn't felt in so long I'd forgotten its name. Hope. That's when he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. My breath caught in my throat like a bird trying to escape a cage. I wasn't expecting this. Not so soon, not at my age. But there it was, sitting in his palm like a promise. He opened it to reveal a simple gold band with a tiny diamond that caught the last rays of sunlight and threw them back like stars. It wasn't much by some standards, but to me, it might as well have been the crown jewels of England. Owen told me he knew it was fast, knew people would talk, but he said he'd never felt about anyone the way he felt about me. He said I made him want to be a better man, that my strength inspired him, that he couldn't imagine spending the rest of his life with anyone else. When he asked me to marry him, his voice shook just a little, and that tremor in his voice convinced me more than all his pretty words that this was real. I said yes before I even realized the word had left my mouth. The ring fit perfectly, which should have surprised me, but didn't at the time. I was too caught up in the moment, in the feeling of being chosen, being wanted, being loved by someone who saw beauty in my wrinkled hands and silver hair. When Owen slipped that ring onto my finger, it felt like he was slipping a new life onto me along with it. We were married 3 weeks later at the courthouse in the next county over, with just the justice of the peace and his secretary as witnesses. Owen said he wanted to keep it simple, intimate, just the two of us starting our life together without all the fuss and judgment that a big wedding would bring. At the time, I thought it was romantic. Now I wonder if he just wanted to make sure there were as few witnesses as possible to what came next. The first sign that something wasn't quite right came on our wedding night. Owen was enthusiastic, you might say. More than enthusiastic. It was like he couldn't get enough of me, and while part of me was flattered by his passion, another part was overwhelmed. I'd been with one man my whole adult life, and Roy had never shown much interest in that side of marriage. But Owen, he was different. He was insatiable. That first night turned into the next morning, and the next, and the next. Every day, multiple times a day, he'd reach for me with this hunger in his eyes that both thrilled and frightened me. I'd try to suggest we do other things, take a walk, watch television, visit the neighbors, but Owen always seemed to steer us back to the bedroom. At first, I told myself this was what passionate love looked like. I'd never had it before, so how would I know? Maybe this was what I'd been missing all those years with Roy. Maybe this was what it felt like to be truly desired by a man who couldn't keep his hands off me. But as the weeks turned into months, something started nagging at me. It was the way Owen watched me sometimes when he thought I wasn't looking, like he was studying me, measuring me against some invisible standard. It was how he'd ask detailed questions about my health, my doctor visits, my family history of heart problems. It was how he'd insist we stay active, even when I was tired, even when my body was crying out for rest. The worst part was how isolated I started to feel. Owen didn't like it when I went to town alone, said he worried about me driving by myself. He didn't encourage me to make friends or visit with neighbors, said we had each other, and that was enough. Slowly, without me even realizing it was happening, my world got smaller and smaller until it was just me, Owen, and our house on Elm Street. But even with all that, I didn't suspect the truth. How could I? Who would imagine that someone could plot murder through love? That passion could be a weapon, that a marriage bed could become a crime scene. The night I finally understood what was really happening to me. I was lying in our bed, listening to Owen's breathing, even out into sleep. And I felt something cold settle in my chest like ice forming on a winter pond. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt strong. By our 3rd month of marriage, I was living in what I can only describe as a beautiful prison. Every morning, Owen would bring me coffee in bed with that same sweet smile, kiss my forehead like I was precious cargo, and tell me how much he loved waking up next to me. Then he'd spend the rest of the day proving just how much he loved me, 8 times over, sometimes more. I started making excuses to avoid going to town because I was ashamed of how I looked. The constant exhaustion had carved dark circles under my eyes that makeup couldn't hide. My hands shook when I tried to write checks at the grocery store. I'd lost weight I couldn't afford to lose, and my clothes hung on me like empty sacks. When Mrs. Henderson next door asked if I was feeling poorly, I told her I was just adjusting to married life at my age, trying to laugh it off like it was nothing more than an old woman's adjustment to having a young husband. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in November when I woke up and couldn't catch my breath. My heart was racing like I'd run a mile, but I'd only been sleeping. Owen found me sitting on the edge of the bed, gasping like a fish out of water, and for a moment, just a split second, I saw something flicker across his face that wasn't concern. It was anticipation. He drove me to Dr. Evans's office in town, holding my hand the whole way and murmuring reassurances about how I was probably just overexerted, how we'd been keeping such an active lifestyle, how natural it was for a woman my age to feel tired sometimes. The way he said it, so understanding and caring, should have comforted me. Instead, it made my skin crawl. Dr. Evans ran some tests and told me what I already knew in my bones. My heart was under tremendous strain. My blood pressure was dangerously high, my pulse irregular, my body showing signs of severe stress and exhaustion. He asked about my diet, my exercise routine, my sleep patterns, and I found myself lying about all of it while Owen squeezed my hand supportively. The doctor prescribed rest, quiet activities, maybe some light reading or gentle gardening. He said I needed to avoid any strenuous physical activity for at least a month, maybe longer. He looked directly at Owen when he said this, man to man, and I saw Owen nod solemnly like a devoted husband who would do anything to protect his wife's health. That should have been the end of it. That should have been my salvation. Instead, it became my nightmare. Because Owen didn't stop. If anything, he became more attentive, more passionate, more insistent. When I tried to remind him of the doctor's orders, he'd smile and say that what we shared wasn't strenuous. It was love. And love was healing. When I said I was too tired, he'd massage my shoulders and whisper about how he couldn't bear to be apart from me, how touching me was like breathing to him, how denying our connection would be worse for my heart than honoring it. And like a fool, I believed him. Or maybe I wanted to believe him. Maybe after 40 years of being unwanted, I couldn't bear to push away the one person who seemed to desire me so completely. The town started to notice my decline. When I did venture out, usually with Owen's arm around my waist to steady me, people would stare and whisper. I heard fragments of conversations that made my cheeks burn with shame. They said I looked like death warmed over, that marrying a man so much younger had worn me down to nothing, that I was making a fool of myself trying to keep up with a boy in his prime. What they didn't say, what none of us said, was that I looked like a woman being slowly murdered by love. The worst part was that I still believed it was love. Even as my body began to fail, even as climbing the stairs left me breathless and my hands trembled when I tried to hold a coffee cup, I told myself this was the price of passion, the cost of finally having someone who couldn't get enough of me. I had no idea that Owen was counting on exactly that. I had no idea that my exhaustion wasn't a side effect of his love. It was the point of it. I had no idea that every kiss, every caress, every whispered endearment was another shovelful of dirt on what was meant to be my grave. The revelation came to me the way most terrible truths do. Not all at once like lightning, but slowly, like blood seeping through a bandage you thought was clean. It was a cold December morning, about 5 months into our marriage, when I found myself alone in the house for the first time in weeks. Owen had driven to Tulsa to handle some business he said couldn't wait, something about paperwork from his old job. He'd kissed me goodbye at dawn, told me to rest, and promised to be back by supper. I should have been relieved to have a day to myself, to let my body recover without Owen's constant attention. Instead, I felt anxious, like a part of me was missing. That should have been my first clue that something was deeply wrong. When you can't stand to be alone in your own skin, it means someone's been rewriting the rules of who you are. I spent the morning trying to read, but the words kept swimming on the page. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the book steady. By noon, I decided to make myself some soup, thinking maybe food would help settle whatever was wrong with me. But when I stood up from my chair, the room tilted sideways and I had to grab onto the kitchen counter to keep from falling. That's when I saw it. Owen's coffee cup from that morning, sitting in the sink with a thin film of something powdery around the rim. I'd never noticed it before, but then again, Owen always insisted on bringing me my morning coffee in bed, always handed me the cup himself, always watched with those loving eyes as I drank every last drop. My heart started hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. I picked up that cup with trembling fingers and held it up to the light streaming through my kitchen window. There, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, was a residue that definitely wasn't coffee grounds. I thought about how I'd been feeling worse in the mornings, how the exhaustion seemed to compound overnight, how some days I could barely remember what I'd done the day before. I thought about Owen's detailed questions about my health, his insistence that we maintain our active lifestyle despite the doctor's warnings, his strange satisfaction whenever I had to sit down and catch my breath. But even then, even with that cup in my hands and suspicion crawling up my spine like ice water, I couldn't quite believe what my mind was trying to tell me. Because believing it would mean accepting that the man who held me every night, who whispered sweet things in my ear, who promised to love me until death do us part, was actively working to make sure that death came sooner rather than later. I put the cup back in the sink and told myself I was being paranoid. Old women get suspicious of everything, I reasoned. 40 years of marriage to Roy had taught me to see threats where none existed. Owen was young and passionate and maybe didn't understand how fragile an older woman's body could be, but he wasn't. He couldn't be. That afternoon, while Owen was still gone, I walked to Dr. Evans' office. I told his nurse I was having some new symptoms, some concerns that couldn't wait for a regular appointment. When the doctor finally saw me, I asked him straight out if there were substances someone could put in food or drink that might cause exhaustion, heart palpitations, confusion. Dr. Evans looked at me for a long moment, his kind eyes growing sharp with something that might have been concern or might have been recognition. He asked me why I was asking such a question, if there was something specific I was worried about. But how could I tell him? How could I say that I suspected my husband, my much younger, devoted, loving husband, might be slowly poisoning me? Instead, I made up some story about reading an article in a magazine, about being curious for no particular reason. He gave me a look that said he didn't believe me for 1 second, but he answered anyway. He told me there were indeed substances that could cause those symptoms, things that might not show up on routine blood tests unless you knew specifically what to look for. When I got home that evening, Owen's truck was already in the driveway. He met me at the door with worry written all over his face, asking where I'd been, saying he'd come home early to surprise me and found the house empty. He held me close and told me how frightened he'd been, how he couldn't bear the thought of something happening to me while he was away. Standing there in his arms, feeling his heart beat against my cheek, smelling his familiar cologne, I almost convinced myself that my suspicions were just the paranoid fantasies of a sick old woman. Almost. But then he handed me a cup of tea he said he'd made special for me to help me feel better after what must have been an exhausting walk to town. And as I took that cup, as I looked into his loving, concerned face, I saw something else lurking behind those green eyes. I saw a man who was growing impatient with how long it was taking me to die. That night, I lay in bed next to Owen, listening to him breathe, and I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of drinking the tea he'd made me, I'd poured it down the kitchen sink when he wasn't looking and told him it had tasted wonderful. For the first time in months, I slept through the night without waking up in a cold sweat or feeling like my heart was trying to crawl out of my chest. The next morning, when Owen brought me my usual coffee in bed, I waited until he went to shower and then poured that down the bathroom sink too. I felt stronger that day than I had in weeks, clearer somehow, like fog was lifting from my brain. It was then I knew for certain what I'd been too frightened to accept. My loving husband had been slowly killing me, one cup at a time. But knowing something and proving it are two different things entirely, especially when you're a 67-year-old woman married to a charming young man who has the whole town fooled. Who would believe me? The same people who already thought I was a foolish old woman chasing after inappropriate love? The same neighbors who whispered that I was making a spectacle of myself? I started watching Owen more carefully, pretending to be sicker than I was while secretly growing stronger. I noticed how he always prepared my drinks himself, never letting me help in the kitchen when he was making something special for me. I saw how his face would tighten with something that looked like frustration when I had good days, when I seemed more alert or energetic than usual. Most telling of all, I started paying attention to his phone calls. Owen thought I was too foggy-headed to notice much of anything anymore, but my hearing was still sharp. I heard him talking to someone about insurance policies, about beneficiaries, about how these things sometimes took time, but patience always paid off in the end. When I asked him about it later, he smiled and said he'd been talking to his buddy about some investments, nothing for me to worry my pretty head about. Pretty head, like I was some empty-brained doll instead of a woman who'd survived nearly 7 decades on this earth. The breaking point came on a snowy January afternoon, when I pretended to take a nap and heard Owen on the phone in the kitchen. This conversation was different from the others, more urgent, more frustrated. He was talking about how the old woman was taking longer than expected, how maybe they needed to increase the dosage or try a different approach. He mentioned something about making it look like a heart attack, about how no one would question it given my age and recent health problems. Then he said something that turned my blood to ice water. He mentioned that this wasn't his first time dealing with a stubborn old bird, that he'd learned from his mistakes with the woman in Arkansas. There had been another woman before me. Another wife, probably. Another victim who'd thought she'd found love in her golden years, and instead found death wearing a young man's smile. I lay there in our bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, and I understood with perfect, terrible clarity that I wasn't Owen's wife. I was his project, his target, his meal ticket to whatever inheritance he thought I had, whatever life insurance policy he'd convinced me to sign, whatever assets a man like him could milk from a lonely old woman's corpse. The worst part wasn't even that he was trying to kill me. The worst part was that he was so good at it, so patient and methodical, that I'd nearly let him succeed. I'd been so grateful for his attention, so hungry for affection after 40 years of Roy's coldness, that I'd walked willingly into a trap that should have been obvious to anyone with half a brain. But I wasn't dead yet, and if Owen had made one mistake, it was underestimating exactly how stubborn this old bird could be when she finally understood what she was up against. That night, when he reached for me with that familiar hunger in his eyes, I let him think I was still the weak, compliant woman he'd been slowly murdering for months. But inside, I was planning. I was thinking. I was figuring out how to turn the tables on a predator who thought he'd found the perfect prey. Because if there's one thing 40 years of marriage to Roy Davis had taught me, it was how to survive a man who wanted to destroy me. And Owen Mitchell was about to learn that this particular old woman had more fight left in her than he'd ever imagined. The next few weeks were the most terrifying of my life, and that's saying something considering I'd lived through 40 years with Roy Davis. Every morning became a performance worthy of Broadway, pretending to drink the coffee Owen brought me while secretly pouring it out, acting weak and confused while my mind grew sharper with each passing day, letting him think his plan was working while I gathered the evidence I needed to prove what he was doing to me. But Owen wasn't stupid, and I could tell he was getting suspicious. He started asking me pointed questions about how I was feeling, watching me more carefully when he thought I wasn't looking. One morning, I caught him checking the bathroom sink, running his finger along the drain like he was looking for something specific. My heart nearly stopped. Had I been careless? Had I left traces of the coffee I'd been dumping? That's when I started getting creative. I began carrying a small thermos bottle in my bathrobe pocket, the kind you use for keeping soup warm. When Owen would bring me my morning coffee, I'd take a few sips to satisfy him, then pretend to doze while secretly pouring the rest into the thermos. Later, when he was outside or busy in another room, I'd dump it in the flower bed behind the house. Those poor roses never bloomed right again, which should tell you something about what Owen had been putting in my drinks. But my clever little system nearly got me killed when Owen decided to stick around one morning instead of going into town like usual. He brought me my coffee with that same loving smile, kissed my forehead like always, and then settled into the chair beside our bed with a book, saying he wanted to spend a quiet morning with his beautiful wife. I had no choice but to drink that coffee, every last bitter drop, while he watched me with those green eyes that I now knew held nothing but calculation. Within an hour, I was sicker than I'd been since this whole nightmare started. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. My hands shook so badly I couldn't hold a glass of water, and the room kept spinning like I was trapped inside a washing machine. Owen played the concerned husband perfectly, calling Dr. Evans, helping me get dressed, driving me to the clinic while I slumped against the passenger door, fighting to stay conscious. But I noticed things that day that I'd missed before. How he took his time getting me to the car. How he drove just a little slower than necessary. How he kept glancing at me with what I now recognized wasn't worry, but anticipation. He was waiting for me to collapse. He was hoping this would be the day his patience finally paid off. Dr. Evans took one look at me and immediately started running tests. My blood pressure was through the roof, my heart rhythm was all over the place, and I could see the concern in his eyes even as he tried to reassure Owen that these episodes sometimes happened with elderly patients. But when Owen stepped out to move the car, Dr. Evans leaned close to me and asked quietly if there was anything at all, that I needed to tell him. I wanted to tell him everything right then and there. I wanted to grab his coat and scream about what Owen was doing to me, about the coffee and the other woman in Arkansas, and the phone calls about insurance policies. But I was so sick, so confused from whatever Owen had given me that morning, that all I could do was squeeze his hand and whisper that I was scared. Dr. Evans looked at me for a long moment, then said something I'll never forget. He told me that sometimes when people are afraid, it's because they should be. He said that fear could be a gift, a warning system that kept us alive when our rational minds couldn't process what was happening to us. Then he gave me a small piece of paper with his home phone number written on it, told me to call him any time, day or night, if I ever needed help. When Owen came back into the examination room, I palmed that piece of paper like it was a lifeline, which in many ways it was. The ride home was quiet, except for Owen's soft reassurances about how we'd get through this together, how he'd take even better care of me now, how much he loved me despite how difficult things had become. Every word felt like a nail being hammered into my coffin, because I understood now that my getting sicker wasn't a side effect of his plan. It was the plan. That night, as I lay in bed pretending to sleep while Owen's breathing evened out beside me, I realized I was running out of time. He was getting bolder, more impatient. The doses were getting stronger, the episodes more severe. Whatever timeline he'd set for himself, we were approaching the end of it. I had maybe days, maybe weeks, before Owen Mitchell succeeded in murdering me with kindness. And the terrible truth was that when I died, everyone in Guthrie would shake their heads sadly and say what a shame it was that poor Garnet couldn't handle the excitement of being married to such a young, devoted man. They'd never suspect that the devoted husband crying at my funeral was the same man who'd spent months slowly poisoning me to death, one loving cup of coffee at a time. The decision to fight back came to me on a Wednesday morning in February when I woke up to find Owen sitting in the chair beside our bed, just watching me sleep. Not reading, not doing anything else, just watching me with those green eyes that had once seemed so loving and now looked like a cat studying a wounded bird. When he saw I was awake, he smiled that same sweet smile and told me he'd been thinking about taking a little trip, maybe driving down to Arkansas to visit some old friends. He said the change of scenery might do us both good, that maybe the warmer weather down south would help with my health problems. The way he said it, so casual and caring, made my skin crawl because I knew exactly what kind of old friends he wanted to visit in Arkansas. He wanted to show me off to whoever had helped him with the woman before me. Or maybe he wanted to finish what he'd started somewhere far from Dr. Evans and the few people in Guthrie who might ask uncomfortable questions if I died too suddenly. Either way, I knew that if I got in a car with Owen Mitchell and drove to Arkansas, I'd never see Oklahoma again. That afternoon, while Owen was in town supposedly running errands, I made a decision that went against every instinct I'd developed in nearly 7 decades of trying to be a good woman who didn't cause trouble. I called Dr. Evans' home number. When he answered, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told him straight out that my husband was poisoning me, that I'd been pretending to take the medications and drinks he gave me, that I was stronger when I avoided what Owen prepared for me. I told him about the phone calls I'd overheard, about the woman in Arkansas, about Owen's sudden interest in taking a trip south. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought Dr. Evans was going to tell me I was a paranoid old woman imagining things. Instead, he asked me if I could get him a sample of whatever Owen had been giving me. He said there were tests they could run, ways to prove what I suspected, but he needed evidence. The next morning, when Owen brought me my coffee, I did something that took more courage than leaving Roy ever had. I pretended to drink it while secretly filling a small medicine bottle I'd hidden under my pillow. The acting required was Oscar-worthy. I had to seem sick enough to satisfy Owen while not so sick that I couldn't function, had to appear grateful for his care while fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run. After Owen left for town, I drove that sample to Dr. Evans' office with hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. Dr. Evans took one look at the liquid in that bottle, and his face went white as fresh cotton. He told me he'd rush it to the lab in Oklahoma City, that we'd have results within 2 days, that in the meantime, I should be very, very careful about what I ate or drank. But being careful wasn't going to be enough anymore, because when I got home that afternoon, Owen was waiting for me with suitcases packed and the car loaded. He said he'd decided we shouldn't wait for the trip to Arkansas, that we should leave right away while I was still well enough to travel. He'd already called his friends down south, he said, and they were expecting us. Standing there in my own driveway, looking at those packed suitcases, I realized that Owen had figured out something was wrong. Maybe he'd noticed I wasn't as sick as I should have been. Maybe he'd found traces of coffee in places it shouldn't be. Maybe he'd just decided his timeline needed to be moved up. Whatever had changed, he was done being patient. I told him I wasn't feeling well enough to travel, that maybe we should wait a few more days. But Owen's smile didn't reach his eyes when he said he'd already made arrangements, that the friends in Arkansas included a doctor who specialized in treating elderly patients, that it would be better for me to be somewhere I could get proper care if my condition worsened. Proper care. From a doctor who was probably part of whatever scheme Owen was running. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. Every creak of the house settling made me wonder if Owen was getting tired of waiting for me to die naturally and had decided to speed things along. I kept Dr. Evans' phone number clutched in my hand like a prayer. But what good would it do me if we were halfway to Arkansas by the time the test results came back? As I lay there in the dark, listening to Owen breathe beside me, I came to a realization that should have terrified me, but instead filled me with a strange kind of peace. I was probably going to die in the next few days, one way or another. Owen was done playing games, done being patient. But if I was going down, I wasn't going down quiet. If Owen Mitchell thought he could add my name to his list of victims without a fight, he was about to learn that this old woman from Guthrie, Oklahoma, had more backbone than he'd bargained for. The question wasn't whether I was going to Arkansas. The question was whether I was coming back alive. And I had one last, desperate plan to make sure the answer was yes. The morning we were supposed to leave for Arkansas, I woke up before dawn with a clarity that felt like divine intervention. Owen was still sleeping beside me, one arm thrown across my waist like he owned me. And I knew this was my last chance to save my own life. I slipped out of bed quiet as a ghost and made my way to the kitchen, where I did something that went against every fiber of my being as a polite Southern woman. I opened Owen's wallet, which he'd left on the counter next to his keys, and I started going through it like a common thief. What I found made my blood run cold. Behind his driver's license was another ID with a different name, Marcus Webb, and tucked behind that was a small photograph of a woman who looked to be about my age, smiling at the camera with trusting eyes. Written on the back in faded ink was Margaret, age 71, and a date from 2 years ago. Margaret, the woman from Arkansas, the one whose death had been ruled a heart attack. I was still standing there, holding that photograph with trembling hands, when Owen appeared in the kitchen doorway. He took one look at what I was holding, and his whole demeanor changed like someone had flipped a switch. Gone was the loving, concerned husband. In his place stood a stranger with cold eyes and a smile that had nothing warm about it. He told me it was too bad I'd seen that he'd really hoped we could do this the easy way. He said Margaret had been stubborn too, had started asking too many questions near the end, and it had made things more complicated than they needed to be. But he'd learned from his mistakes with her, he said. He knew better now how to handle difficult situations. Owen reached into the drawer behind him and pulled out a bottle of pills, my heart medication, the ones Dr. Evans had prescribed months ago. But when Owen shook them, they didn't sound right. Too light, too hollow, like they'd been tampered with. He told me we had two choices. I could take a handful of these pills with a glass of water and go to sleep peacefully, or he could make me take them another way that wouldn't be nearly as pleasant. Either option would look like a heart attack brought on by the stress of traveling, he said. No one would question it. As Owen moved toward me with those pills, I did the only thing I could think of. I started screaming. Not the polite, ladylike call for help that my upbringing had taught me, but the raw, primal scream of a woman fighting for her life. I screamed loud enough to wake Mrs. Henderson next door, loud enough to bring the mailman running, loud enough to shatter the careful facade Owen had built around our marriage. And in that moment of chaos, as Owen lunged for me and I scrambled toward the back door, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Sirens in the distance, getting closer by the second. Someone had heard me. Someone was coming. Those sirens belonged to Dr. Evans and Sheriff Morrison, who'd been driving toward my house with test results that proved everything I'd suspected and more. The lab had found not just one poison in my coffee sample, but a cocktail of substances designed to mimic the symptoms of heart failure in elderly patients. Dr. Evans said it was one of the most sophisticated murder plots he'd ever encountered, and that without the sample I'd provided, Owen would have gotten away with it completely. But the real twist came when Sheriff Morrison ran Owen's fingerprints and discovered that Marcus Webb wasn't his only alias. Over the past 10 years, he'd been David Martinez in New Mexico, Paul Richardson in Colorado, and Thomas Wheeler in Kansas. Each identity had been married to a wealthy widow. Each widow had died of apparent natural causes within 6 months of the wedding. Each death had left him with substantial life insurance payouts. I wasn't his second victim. I was his sixth. The FBI found a storage unit in Tulsa filled with documents, photographs, and what they called trophies from each marriage. There were death certificates, insurance policies, and jewelry that had belonged to 5 other women who'd thought they'd found love in their golden years. Women like Margaret from Arkansas, whose photograph I'd found in Owen's wallet. Women like Dorothy from Colorado, who died at 73 after 3 months of marriage to Paul Richardson. Women whose families had grieved their natural deaths, never knowing they'd been murdered. When the whole story came out in the newspapers, some people in Guthrie acted like I was some kind of hero for exposing Owen. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like the luckiest woman alive, and maybe the most foolish for falling for his act in the first place. The truth is, I survived because I'd learned something important during my 40 years with Roy Davis. When someone wants to hurt you, they'll find a way to make it seem like love. Roy used his fists and cruel words. Owen used poison and false affection. Both of them counted on me being too ashamed, too isolated, or too grateful for attention to fight back. But here's what I want every woman my age to understand. It's never too late to trust your instincts. It's never too late to ask for help. And it's never too late to discover that you're stronger than anyone, including yourself, ever imagined. I'm 81 now, sitting on my porch in Guthrie, and I'm still here. Still breathing, still fighting, still believing that every sunrise brings the possibility of something better. If my story teaches you anything, let it be this. Don't let anyone convince you that your time for living, for loving, for being treated with respect is over. And if someone seems too good to be true, trust that feeling in your gut that says something isn't right. Now then, if you're still listening to this old woman's tale, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need to hear it. Where are you watching from tonight? I'd love to know that my words are reaching women all over this country who deserve to know they're not alone. Those sirens belonged to Dr. Evans and Sheriff Morrison, who'd been driving toward my house with test results that proved everything I'd suspected and more. The lab had found not just one poison in my coffee sample, but a cocktail of substances designed to mimic heart failure in elderly patients. Dr. Evans said it was one of the most sophisticated murder plots he'd ever encountered. But the real twist came when they searched Owen's belongings and found a small leather journal hidden in his truck. Inside were detailed notes about me, my daily routines, my health history, my finances, even observations about my loneliness after leaving Roy. But most chilling of all were the calculations, dosage amounts, timeline projections, and a careful record of my declining health that read like a scientist documenting an experiment. On the last page, in Owen's neat handwriting, was a list of names. 5 women's names, with dates and locations beside each one. Margaret from Arkansas was there, along with Dorothy from Colorado, Helen from New Mexico, and others I'd never heard of. Next to each name was a dollar amount. Insurance payouts, I realized with horror. My name was at the bottom of that list, with a question mark where the payout amount should have been. Sheriff Morrison told me later that when they arrested Owen, he didn't deny anything. In fact, he seemed almost proud of what he'd accomplished, boasting about how easy it had been to convince lonely old women that a young man could genuinely love them. He called it mercy killing, said he was putting miserable old ladies out of their misery while getting paid for his trouble. The FBI investigation that followed revealed Owen had been running this scheme for over a decade, moving from state to state, always targeting recently divorced or widowed women with modest savings and good life insurance policies. He'd study them for weeks before making contact, learning everything about their vulnerabilities, their desperate hunger for companionship. What saved me, the investigators said, was that I'd learned to recognize predators from my years with Roy. The survival instincts I'd developed in that abusive marriage, the hypervigilance, the ability to sense danger even when it wore a loving face, had kept me alive when Owen's charm offensive should have killed me. Today, I'm 81 years old and still breathing, still rocking on this porch in Guthrie, where the summer heat reminds me that I'm alive to feel it. Owen's in prison now, where he'll spend the rest of his life thinking about the old woman who got away. If you're listening to my story, and you're a woman who's lived long enough to have some gray in your hair, remember this. Your wisdom is not weakness, your caution is not paranoia, and your right to be treated with genuine love and respect doesn't have an expiration date. Share my story if it moves you, because somewhere out there might be another woman who needs to hear that it's never too late to fight for your own life. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? I'd love to know my words are traveling to women who understand that surviving is its own kind of victory.